online, poor old Albert Einstein is credited with so many different quotes that you'd think he lived for the last 200 years across all centuries and every technology that we've known. But one thing that Einstein did say is compellingly true for our world that we live in today. He said, "I am enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution." He said that in 1929 in an interview. Calling himself an artist and referring to the use of his imagination, he also pointed out, with regards to coming up with the theory of relativity, he said, "I thought of it while riding my bicycle." And you know, that is a common experience in imagination and creativity. Imagination is one of those things that we associate with children, we associate it with artists, and we might even say or hear someone say, "I don't have much of an imagination." Could it be true that an adult doesn't have much of an imagination, perhaps compared with a child? Is it really relevant, as Einstein says, that imagination is more important than knowledge? I mean, is it true that imagination is more important than knowledge? Well, one of the questions we need to ask is, would we have knowledge without imagination? What makes us explore, trying to find out something, trying to break new boundaries of knowledge? In fact, it seems that in practically every area of our lives, we need and use imagination in order to be successful. So today I want to talk a little bit about what the value of imagination is, and more importantly, a few tips to develop it so that you can benefit from the imagination, because the benefits of developing and knowing and using your imagination are in your everyday life as well as in your spiritual life, and it can actually make everything a lot more livable and a lot more understandable. Of course, we associate imagination especially with artists, and one of the artists who really speaks about imagination in a way that I think is relevant to all of us is the fiction writer Jeff Coleman. He says, "You were born a philosopher. As a child you spent hours beneath the stars, hypnotized by the transcendent mysteries of the cosmos. But with age came the people who told you it was time to grow up, that it was time to shed your imagination like a used skin so that you could focus on more pragmatic concerns. You always thought secretly that they were wrong, that you should never trade your fantasies for an ordinary life. But the world would always bear down on you with its facts and figures, wearing away at your soul like a grinding stone until you begin to crack and buckle around the edges." He's suggesting that imagination is drummed out of us, it's worn down, it is consistently replaced by the need to be practical, to be successful, to do things in a much more tangible way, in that way. On the other hand, he says, imagination is like a light that dispels the darkness of that stony, rational, ordinary life that we live, and makes the inaccessible accessible. It makes the cosmos accessible. He says it's like a mental framework, a way of perceiving the world. So the important thing about imagination is that it isn't a system of knowledge. It isn't access to knowledge. It is a framework that provides a way to access knowledge, to access the answers, to perhaps discover them, and at the very least, to access and discover our own creativity. Because like imagination, creativity can be something that we associate only with children, that we associate only with special people like artists. But like artists, we all have imaginations. And like artists, we are all creative. So imagination and creativity, which in some ways go hand in hand, can help us develop those faculties and bring out the better problem solving, knowledge finding, mystery busting aspects of the imagination that would be so useful to an adult. Coleman says that imagination is like a mentor. It precedes every great discovery. And so what does it do that allows a great discoverer to make that great discovery? Well, it allows us to see things as they are not, but might be. It allows us to envision possibility. It allows us to envision solutions, but to envision things that have never been there. So it works like a mentor, giving us an internal vision. And that internal vision allows us to shape our reality or our circumstances according to the guidance of that internal vision. And Coleman says, like that, we become shapers of reality, not merely consumers of reality. I think one of the great confusions about imagination today is this idea that we can envision something and attract it towards us. That's where we've gone a little bit wrong, and it's a little bit like a fantasy that says, oh, you can imagine anything you want and just have it. It was a fantasy popularized in that ridiculous book, The Secret, which was a more money-making exercise, and certainly the author of that book used her imagination very effectively. But she didn't use her imagination by the techniques that she recommends, imagining something and it just comes to you. She used it by imagining something and actually going out and doing it. Imagination gives us guidance to what we could do. It lets us envision possibilities and plan for the results. So it's not a magical tool that automatically attracts things through some kind of mysterious law of attraction that is supposed to exist. But actually it puts the power in our hands to actually make something happen. So we can't be passive creatures. We can be passive in accessing things via our imagination. And we'll talk more about that in the techniques that help you develop imagination. But it's very important to understand that at some point the passivity stops and we've got to get ourselves into action. We've actually got to turn the imagination into the reality ourselves. One of the things that we know about children and creative people, but especially children, is that they don't use strong tools of self-control. In fact, the lack of self-control itself is associated with creative people and with children. And that sense of I can do anything and anything might happen and it's all available to me comes from that lack of control. Some psychologists say that what you really need to do is learn to abandon some of that self-control. Learn to let go of those strictures that perhaps Coleman, the writer, is describing as what grinds us down. And that's really our self-control, obeying the rules all the time, and the constant telling ourselves and repeating what we've heard, you're not allowed to do that, you may not do that. What we're not allowed to do seems much more important the older we get. We increasingly tell children what they're not allowed to do, and ultimately we teach them, we teach our human species that if you don't control yourself, someone else is going to control you. So self-control makes you follow the rules of the society, which is trying to be productive. Ironically, productivity requires imagination because we need to envision what's not there. If we're going to come up with great ideas, if we're going to make plans for our future, if we're going to develop policies of how we might be, how might we have a better country. Imagination is not only about the arts, it's envisioning where to next, a power that is quite special to the human race. Perhaps not as unique to us as many biologists and others like to believe. I'm not convinced of that. But certainly that need that we have to envision our futures and then create them is certainly something that requires an imagination. We can't create brilliant political policies without envisioning them and coming up with a brilliant plan and having a vision of a better society. We won't attract it just by sitting there. We've then got to do the hard work, but everything requires imagination. The value of imagination is beyond just envisioning and producing, but it has further value in our everyday lives. Most significantly, it reduces stress. Imagination allows us to envision an outcome. So by having some sense of outcome or the bigger picture, it can lower our stress levels and increase our ability to envision better outcomes. Once the stress is removed and the anxiety of having to be in control, we open ourselves further and allow for new outcomes to happen. You know, one of the reasons why our imagination wanes, and certainly our creativity wanes, is because of that clamp down on be more controlled. We're taught more, we have to be more logical and more reasonable and concentrate on facts, and that becomes our lives, and we simply stop practicing with our imaginations and our creativity. We stop doing creativity. Perhaps it's also because we're afraid of being wrong. You know, children don't worry about whether they're wrong until they get taught to by adults. They don't even worry about whether something's going to work or not, whether the outcome of their huge imaginative game or project is actually going to be ideal, right, because they've also got the ability to constantly adapt to that outcome or to just see it differently because of those imaginations. We have such a fear of being wrong as we grow. We're told that being wrong has bad consequences for us. And so because of those bad consequences, we even penalize, if you think it's school, exams and all of that, we actually get into trouble or suffer consequences for being wrong. That dramatically narrows the imagination because it basically says, unless you go by hard facts, you're going to get punished. So possibilities and improbabilities, things that don't look like that happen that way, become unwanted because they're likely to bring consequences, and so our imagination is reduced that way. Basically, if you're afraid of being wrong, you're never going to try everything. If you're afraid of being wrong, there would never be anything original because we know how to do things right, so we'd constantly be just doing it right. But when we don't have to be right and we're looking for solutions, and the need to find a creative solution is what allows us to employ the imagination. But in order to do that, we really have to break that pattern of this is how things are done and this is how things should be done. You know, thinking about it in terms of how the brain operates. The brain creates neural networks and neural pathways. And that when we go through a thinking process or a problem-solving process, all sorts of electric energy moves around in our brain. Think about it like electric currents on wires. And so pathways are established patterns in the brain that relate to our thinking processes. And once we've got an established pattern, it becomes better and better used. Like any pathway through the woods, it becomes well-worn, well-tread, and easy to follow because it's so well-worn. So our brain falls into patterns of doing that. We now know that the brain is capable of finding new pathways when under dire circumstances. Brain injuries can do it with help from training people, and all sorts of challenges can force the brain to develop new pathways. What happens when we've developed a life of not being wrong, of following the rules, and always doing things a specific way because we know the outcome is going to work, is that we start settling into fixed pathways. And those fixed pathways cut out the need for imagination. I don't need to find a new way to do this because the old tried and tested way will come. If we're not confined to those, the brain will look for new pathways. If you look for new solutions or try and envision and imagine. So sometimes it requires stepping back from what you've done and saying, what if that's wrong? What if that's an alternative solution? And trying to find ways to engage the imagination in order to find that solution. So how do we break out of those fixed pathways so that we can use our imagination and become better problem solvers and more creative, fulfilled individuals? Well, one of the obvious ways is to actually engage it by engaging your senses. So you can literally expand your senses. You can do things like when you see a color, ask yourself what that color might sound like or smell like. And then don't get too hung up on what the answer is. Just let your imagination play with it. It might actually spread out and come out with things that you weren't even thinking about. If you ask yourself, how does that color sound? You don't want to know it sounds like A sharp or some clear answer. What if it doesn't? What if it drifts away and you find yourself thinking about something completely different? That's fine. That's your imagination kicking in. Picturing things in a different way and using your senses to identify that as a reality. So when wanting an outcome, to dream something into your life, to dream a way to get there, is to engage all your senses. And when you're trying to get to that outcome, to ask yourself, what do I feel, and what do I hear, and what do I see, and how does this inform all my senses in order for this to become something that is possible? Because as we create the reality of something that way, we can start seeing it's possible. We can start understanding what's necessary to do that. And if we've got the bigger plan of the imagination, we start seeing other solutions that can take us to that outcome because we've loosened ourselves up in some kind of a way. The importance of the imagination is that it allows us to make changes because we've envisioned possibilities and contexts. Again, we must not just do that through the logical mode, we must deliberately engage other techniques in order to do that. A great one is exercise. Einstein was the one who said he thought of relativity while on his bicycle. Many creative people attest to that, runners in particular. But any exercise seems to switch the mind into another mode. The athlete Christopher Berglund says that running is like lubrication oil to the brain. It gets rid of all the rust and makes your thinking more fluid, he says. He says exercise allows your conscious mind to access fresh ideas that are buried in the subconscious mind. And many writers say that writing doesn't happen while you're writing, it happens elsewhere. It happens while you're walking and while you're running. And writers like Joyce Carol Oates have said that writing is actually transcription. That actually the ideas come to you and the ideas come to you and you work them in your mind. She writes by hand and then retypes. And she says by the time she types it on her computer, she's really just writing out what she already now knows. That has been worked through a process that initially doesn't involve any writing at all. And actually is much more about allowing the mind to connect, which she does through running. So exercise, building up a sweat, getting into routine mode, getting to where you're not thinking about everyday stuff. All of us have walked or run or gone to gym and know that mode. And instead of thinking gym is a waste of time, allow your mind to float free, especially if you've got problems to solve or a creative project on the go or something like that. That's what's going to get you to a solution. One of the most important ways to develop the imagination is through play. Play increases creativity more than anything else, especially as an adult, because adults often fail to play. Play can be playing a sport, play can be doing fun things, playing computer games or playing games with other people, doing puzzles. All of those things engage the imagination. But that is the importance of it. People often think that games or computer games are a waste of time, but they engage the imagination in all sorts of ways. So whatever kind of game you play, you enter into its reality, and even though the game is shaping what that reality is about, it engages you at all sorts of levels that would never be in your everyday life and actually enhance the imagination and the ability to problem solve. Evidence shows that the more time you spend playing, the better your creative and imaginative thinking becomes, and the better your problem solving abilities become. You can actually get directly involved in creative, messy things as a way of playing. Finger painting or other kinds of messy painting, or getting involved in such a way that it becomes physical, that you're forced to engage with your play environment in an altogether different way. One of the easiest ways is to read. If you read, especially if you read fiction, your mind automatically creates the picture and you engage with that picture and you become involved with the characters. You become concerned about their lives. All of that engages the imagination. Important to understand, it does not confine your imagination to the topic of that book, to the world that that book lived in. But it really just gives you these different neural pathways that will turn out to help with other solutions. Really, when you read, you're sharing other people's life experiences, but you're engaging with them in an imaginative fashion, and that's the best of both worlds. You do expand your knowledge, but you expand your capacity to access that knowledge or find a way that it relates to you through the process of reading. It's not only fiction reading, it happens through other kinds of reading as well. So when you're reading about new ideas, your mind engages and thinks about it and thinks, is that true? Do I agree? Do I disagree? So deliberately read things you don't know about. Read things that you disagree with, and read things that are way out of your comfort zone. And like that, it challenges and presses the buttons of your imagination. Don't be scared to read something that you disagree with or that presses your button. Don't think of it as trying to persuade yourself about something. Rather think of it as ways to trigger my imagination. What is my response? Very important way for everyday life is to envision outcomes, as I was talking about. Athletes often envision their ability to do something before they can do it. Musicians and other people who have to rehearse and practice a lot, they'll rehearse over and over again in their minds. They'll rehearse the positions of their hands on the keyboard or something like that, and that really helps them when it comes to actually playing the keyboard, that they can see, they can feel, it's as if they've been there before. Imagination is very powerful. It won't play the song for them, but it'll make their ability to play that song much better. Many musicians and athletes attest to the fact that imaginary practice is just as important and just as effective as any other kind of practice that they do. Allow yourself to daydream in those moments sitting in the traffic, in those moments when you're waiting. Don't fill up every moment. Allow yourself to daydream. Think, look at something and let your mind roll, or provoke yourself with silly questions. That's often a way to do it. If you're sitting there in the car and the traffic's not moving, allow a silly question to come to mind by something you can see or something that you heard, and just let yourself play with it. You know, that capacity to engage that way even allows us to access our spiritual life more easily. The act of connecting to spirit, the act of envisioning that we're part of something much bigger, and spiritual practices like meditation and like prayer involve us with an imaginary connection. Imaginary doesn't mean it's not real. Imaginary means it's using the invisible faculty of the brain. When you connect it to spirit, or when you're meditating, the way that you connect it to something bigger is not visible. It's not tangible. It's not obvious in the world, but it's real. You've been practicing your meditation and you know that it's real. So that shows that the imagination is part of our spiritual faculty as well. All the more important reason why we have to develop it. Imagination connects us to our spiritual lives. It gives us the ability to succeed better in our everyday lives. The single most important thing to ensure that our imagination always lives is to remain curious. Don't be satisfied. Ask questions. Challenge. Stretch out of the comfort zone. Be curious all the time. Curiosity keeps us alive, engaged. It gives us new possibilities. If something terrible happens in your life, instead of, say for example, someone gets diagnosed with a disease, or maybe you do, instead of getting caught up with what does that mean and what happens to people with that according to all the rules, remain curious. Think about what kind of treatments do, what does that treatment do, why does it work? Ask questions, find out, remain curious. Don't be satisfied with what you know. The most important thing is that imagination reminds us that as human beings we are more than physical creatures. We've got more than physical capacity, and whatever it is about the world, whatever is the truth about the spiritual life and the spiritual world, one way or the other, it is the imagination that makes that real? Well, the great thing about it is that there's always something new to discover, and hopefully you will find something new to discover here on Rod Suskin's World every week. So join me again next week for a fascinating interview, and of course sign up to the Facebook page to make sure you always know what's going on, what's coming next, and so on. And don't forget, you can still get copies of my book, Your Stars for 2018, to get a more detailed look at the month ahead and the year ahead as it all goes by. I'll see you here next week.